We will now start the webinar of the day. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to everyone. A warm welcome to this webinar. Before starting, for all participants, for all English-speaking participants, you can choose the English language on the icon that is a globe at the bottom on the Zoom screen. The purpose of this cycle of webinars of Greywater reuse is to know of first source successful cases in innovation in reusing gray water, like for the case of Brazil, which is a reference in the subject. That is why we appreciate once again and appreciate the Professor Ricardo Franci for joining us today. I must excuse Professor Paula Paulos, whom due to force majeure couldn't join us today, and to mention that during the webinar we are joined by Dr. Ricardo with Professor Arijon, who will help us with support, and we have Professor Ricardo Franci in the chat or the possibility of raising microphone. Today we have Professor Ricardo Franci, who is an academic of the Federal Academic of Espiritu Santo University and from Fluxo Ingeniería. I hope to have been able to pronounce correctly. He's a civil engineer. He has a doctorate into water treatment and has a degree from Toulouse, France, and a postdoc in water conservation and urban environments of the Technical University of Berlin in Alemania, in Germany. His specialty is water contamination control, particularly the creation, projection, and control, operational control of system of water supply, residual water, wastewater, and industrial wastewater. He has created the procedure of Espiritu Santense Company of Water Waste Management of Public Utility of the state of Espiritu Santo. He has published more than 350 jobs in wastewater treatment. For him, as his project with reusing gray waters, it is a great honor to have today Ricardo Franci. Professor, if you may. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Quijada, and a special greeting of everyone who participates in the webinar, and I am very happy with the invite. And I apologize the fact and that my colleague, Professor Paula, couldn't participate due to personal issues. I will talk about the reuse of gray water in Brazil. I would like to begin talking about the situation that we have in Brazil today regarding water safety. Brazil is considered a country with a lot of water availability. However, what happened is that this water isn't well distributed in our territory. It is very heterogeneous. So, well, there's a lot of people, for example, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, there's very little water. And where there's very little people, there's a lot of water, like the north of the country. So there are many regions, metropolitan regions, with issues of a lack of water. Like in my city, I live in a city where the southeast region of the country, and more or less 2 to 3 years ago, there was a serious issue of the lack of drinking water for the whole city. So, in Brazil, today, there is an intense debate on what we call re-engineering of the urban water cycle, which is a subcycle of the large water cycle found in nature. So we talk greatly about this at different levels of decision making in Brazil. Well, we with the idea of integration between the different levels of management of water resources. So the macro level, which is the basin level, basin management, meso level, which would be at a city level, the water collection systems and sewer system for wastewater, and the micro level, which in general is not considered as such of importance, but without a doubt is such an important level like the other two, because it is here where we find the highest use of water in the cities. Thus, the importance to plan of managing water resources in such a comprehensive fashion, always considering that these three vectors, water, energy, and nutrients, are very important and must be considered in any water management, water resource management. That is the concept found at Nexus. Well, why this level? Why is such an important why is there such importance at the micro level? Well, different projects in water conservation of the cities have published results like these. Water consumption, for example, in my city, which is Vitoria, is 85% in the dwellings, in especially residential buildings. A quite similar figure is found in Sao Paulo and in Minas Gerais. So, if we wish to change the water urban cycle, it is important to consider edifications and buildings. So it is something. And then when you think about practicing of reuse of water, there are many considerations of reusing sewage water to produce water for non-drinkable use. But it is a complicated issue. It is a technical issue, an economic issue. Here we have, as an example, a neighborhood of a residential neighborhood in Vitoria where there is a sewer system which transports and sends residual water for treatment at a treatment plant, at a purifying plant. If the idea is to practice reusing urban wastewater, it is necessary to produce good quality reuse water. And where this water can come back to the buildings in a water supply network, which would configure a double network. This is an issue because it becomes too expensive to build and bring forth the reusable water back towards the residencies. Thus, we've considered as a more simple solution to practice reusing water at the building level, at the edification level. And thus, we are working with this idea of separating the different currents, water currents, in the buildings themselves. And then, of course, Greywaters has a strategic interest due to its characteristics of quantity and quality. So this becomes a model that has been conceived and developed by Professor Ralph Otterpohl in Germany, who proposes a system for drinkable water that come in from a public system. Number two would be blue waters, which would be rainwater, where in Brazil, depending on the region, is where we have very intense rainwater, and it must be considered. Then we have gray water, which are produced constantly, and thus it is interesting to consider this source for the case of reusing. And then you see 4 or 5 different additional currents, the yellow water and brown water, which together make up what we call black water. Based upon this model itself, in 2019, in Brazil, we have carried out the first technical norm and regulation for the use of alternative water sources in edification and buildings. This is a very important point for the practice of using alternative sources of water in Brazil, because up until this year, there have not been a regulation or a norm to cover those who were truly interested in practicing these to make the most of this alternative source of water. So in our new norm and regulations, we have sources of rainwater, we have pluvial drain water, we have a phreatic level, clear water, gray, clear water, dark gray water, black water, and residual water, like sources of potential water source for different edifications. And these are authorized. These uses are used for toilet flushing, street cleaning, exterior areas, vehicle cleaning, irrigation for real estate, ornamental use, water cleaning, roof cleaning. Also, under the function of all of these safety issues, of these water safety issues, more or less 15 years ago, the Brazilian government has launched a program, has started a research program involving the main Brazilian universities and research centers for developing technologies for conserving water in these different edifications. I had the possibility of coordinating this national network for 5 years with results that we consider of great importance and which are even the basis of the new norm, of the new Brazilian norm, of the use of alternative sources of water, for the use of alternative sources of water. I will present a summary of our main results, the results of these research projects, and the first investigations were concentrated mainly upon water conservation on these different edifications. And well, the main point here is that water conservation becomes the result of a decrease of the demand and an increase of the offer, of the water offer. So to decrease and to use water consumption, it becomes of great importance to work with water saving equipment, loss reduction, sectorized consumption to be able to use correctly, and combat waste. And on the offer side, we have talked about making the most of rainwater, the use of water, other water groups which are alternative water sources. And at the end of the day, it is always important to consider that water consumption is the result of the courses of water loss in the hydrosanitary systems and the losses which are related with users and their awareness when they use water. Another important point to consider is to discern and differentiate drinkable water source uses and non-drinkable water uses in these buildings. So, to be able to know about water use and water pathways in buildings, it is important to measure. And we've worked greatly on measurement systems and water sectorizing in the buildings by the end, to calculate different indexes and define water pathways in the edifications, to be able to establish different strategies for water conservation. Here we have a clear example. This is a great shopping center found in our city, whereas our group of researchers have worked for a full year monitoring water consumption in more than 200 hydrometers, at least 2 to 3 times a day, the minimum 2 times a day, to by the end be able to know where each liter of water goes towards, what is the distribution of water in an edification, so that we are able to identify drinkable water uses, non-drinkable waters, and develop a strategy for reuse. It is in this case that we have 2 to 3 different studies on the reuse of greywater, others on the use of industrial wastewater, and a third study on the reuse and of complete reuse of wastewater. An issue I believe that is important. We worked with this Austrian software, which is free and thus can be used after a well-detailed measurement to be able to build this graph correctly and identify the different pathways of water in a building. Well, our research team has also worked on several building and edifications for residential buildings, when the idea is of the reuse of greywater is to change the water sanitary system. We go towards segregating then and separating greywater, which would be the product of the water use due to showers, washrooms, the washing machine, to be able to produce clear water and thus treat at a greywater treatment plant, and to use this water for the sanitary discharge. So this becomes a model which today bring us many buildings in Brazil which are practicing water reuse on these types of hydrosanitary systems. And for this purpose, for those who know the pathways of water, it is important to apply sectorization. So, these types of practices of reusing greywaters demands joint work of multidisciplinary teams with architects, engineers, for treatment biologists and chemists and engineers, so that projects become complete enough. And well, this is a water balance in an edification in a building. And here we have on the graph seen a hydrogram of the basins of the river flow and water flow in time. And in dark blue, we have the production of greywater, of raw greywater, which come into 20 cubic meters in its peak time. But in light blue, we have water flow that has achieved that reuse, which is only a fraction of the raw water basins that we are able to reuse, because it is not possible to use all of the Greywater, especially in Brazil, where water flow that come from the showers are quite high, and in general, the consumption per Brazilian capita for showers is quite high. So it is impossible to reuse this whole flow of gray water because there's no such demand of enough. And reuse waters correspond to 30% of gray water collection. Another important point is characterizing gray water. And since 2005, we've worked on characterizing different gray waters, different edifications, different regions, different levels of our population. Gray water from one building where rich people live would be different from the gray water produced, for example, in the poorer dwellings of the poorer families. So it becomes great and of great importance to know of the characteristics to develop treatment strategies. So, in summary, gray water contain microorganisms, organic material, chemical products, and inert material. And it's important to carry out a good treatment. We have different sources of gray waters. For example, the washroom, showers, this is for clothes, this is for the kitchen, and there's a mix of water consumption. But it's impossible regarding organic material. There would be a high concentration considered that we call in the tank, for example, for water, for clothes washing, also for sulfates. There are many marks here with an important mark for sulfate presence. And as expected, showers contain an important amount, in this case of Escherichia coli, which is an indicator of fecal contamination, of bacterial contamination. So gray water contains organic materials, sulfates, Escherichia coli, suspended solids too, and the treatment to produce a water with a more adequate characteristic in agreement with our norm, it becomes necessary to treat residual waters. This is just a summary of several of the publications. It is important how gray water has very little nitrogen, and sometimes that's why it becomes important to calibrate this relationship and phosphorus. Because if we don't have an adequate carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus relationship, we could have biologic growth issues. And if the treatment practiced is biologic, we could have growth limiting issues. And finally, we will not be able to achieve an adequate efficiency. The main point is that at the end, water has to have nice characteristics for users. This becomes of great importance to avoid the rejection. At the beginning of our research, of our experiences, we thought that a very simple treatment system may be interesting enough. However, the quality of the reuse water with a bit higher fogginess is a bit more complicated for users, which in general would reject this water. So in this case, it becomes difficult to produce reuse water for very sensitive systems. This is an important point. The water, reuse water, has to be very similar to drinkable water so that users do not perceive an important difference among them, do not reject reuse water, because a system where users have questions about water or on its quality is not a sustainable issue. People usually are more considered about organoleptic properties of water, where its content, where for technicians it's important, can have, for example, pathogens. It mustn't degrade water use temperatures, but for the users, what's most important are organoleptic characteristics. Our experiences with treatment. Well, water treatment can be done with physical, chemical, and biological processes that can be associated. The important point to note is that reuse water can't have another color or a high cloudiness, because if not, it will be rejected by different users. Another important point, gray water contains an extreme high amount of hair, sand in some cases. So there are suspended solids that have to be of concern in the treatment strategies. And at the end, if the idea is to, for example, to use water in a toilet flush, it becomes important to consider disinfection. Another very, very simple rule is that for one family dwellings, it becomes possible to use more simple systems, like, for example, wetlands. Now, for of multiple family dwellings, the capacity becomes important. And in this case, it becomes necessary to mechanize different systems. The main point is here. We must always consider the possibility of user rejection on behalf of users due to perception issues of bad quality. In Brazil, there are many, many gray water treatment plants. Physical chemical is like for drinkable water with the use of coagulants, decantation, filtration, and finally disinfection of the water. The most important point here, well, first, the gray water treatment plants, ETAGs in Portuguese, the physical chemical methods are cheap, but needs constant support from coagulants and chemical products. Additionally, they are not capable of removing organic material that is dissolved in the water. So that is the issue, the main issue. If water will stay for a period higher than 24 hours, for example, in different reservoirs, there may be a possibility of smells. Thus, we have to consider this point. The different biological treatment stations in general are more expensive due to implantation and construction, but are cheaper in the long run for operations and maintenance. The stations with wetlands are usually cheap to install and operate. However, but in general, they use very large areas. They usually are used in smaller water flows. And finally, there are gray water treatment plants in Brazil with filtrating membrane, but Brazil does not produce its own filtrating membranes. Thus, it becomes an issue for maintenance of the stations because it needs to import them. However, these are very efficient stations, even though they consume an important amount of energy. So, this is just a quick scheme of the different possibilities of combining processes. Processes, for example, for preliminary treatment, which would be screens, desanding, then biologic processes with filtering, and finally chlorine applications for disinfection where there are different alternatives, evidently with different costs associated to them, according to the complexities of the technology. I've only talked about membranes, which are very efficient. However, they are expensive, and Brazil, there is this issue of the import. In this program of technological development of the federal government, we have developed a technology for biological treatment that combines two high rate reactors. In other words, with short water retention times, where at the end allows us for gray water treatment plants be compact and small enough. And here we have, and consider important, an anaerobic stage, because this stage, even though in gray waters aren't as concentrated in organic material, this part allows elimination of 50%, for example, of DBO without air needs, without the need of mechanizing, the removal of 50% of organic material, which for economic viability of the project is important because the power consumption is something considerable that weighs heavily on economic viability of reuse. After the anaerobic stage, there's an aerobic stage, which in this case, we work with biofilm reactors. And here we have a biologic aerated, submerged bioreactor. Then we have a secondary decanter, a third filtering with sand, and disinfection with chloride at the end. And well, the wash water and the discharge of biologic sludge usually goes towards sewage systems. And at the end, we have our reuse water ready. This combination of processes can generate very compact stations, like in this case, as presented here. Here we have all of the biologic processes. This would be then the gray water mesh, the biologic processes associated to them, the sand filter, and the chlorine application. And these graphs present the results of the treatment. So we have cloudiness, where in the glass, the last step then would be for toilets. So we have the different stages, anaerobic stage, filtering, disinfection, and quality for flushing with cloudiness and bacterial counts in control. And this would be its usual aspect of gray water all over the different water treatment stages towards its final use for flushing and toilets. Here we have the plant that is installed in a hotel of Copacabana in Botafogo, which is a Rio de Janeiro neighborhood. It is a plant for 2 cubic meters per day, and the point of economic viability, which for us is of great importance. Today, our company always, when a commercial technical proposal is made, we always present to clients a preliminary study of economic viability. And this study was carried out in 2004 by this construction company, the company who built this building. It is obviously a complex favela with many figures, but of a great importance is to notice that among all the investments to build this edification, this system of full reuse, water reuse, presented a cost of a little bit more than 1% of the cost to manufacture and build different edifications. So of the whole of 5,500,000 more or less real, the Brazilian coin, 1% would equivalent, a little bit more than 1% equivalent to the value of the whole reuse system. Even the change of the hydrosanitary system to separate gray waters and black waters in and supply of drinkable water and non-drinkable water, and evidently the water treatment station. The same study was presented a cash flow, the payback at the end of the day, which was calculated for 8 years and a half. And in the practice, the payback in this case was of 7 years. Well, the system is exceeded after 7 years of work and functioning. Well, I will go to some examples very quickly. For smaller systems, we work greatly with wetlands. We like these technologies very much because it is very simple. The operations and demands are small, and the owner of the building in general is very satisfied at the end of the day with the end results. This is a bank, a financial bank, in fact, which has 100 workers, and the use is 10 cubic meter per day. We've carried out larger reuse systems, like, for example, this is the Petrobras University, which is a large Brazilian oil manufacturer, and its building is in the center of Rio de Janeiro, and it is a system that produces water for reuse and which also has an expert system for monitoring, for water monitoring and the quality of reused water, and to authorize or not its correct use and edification in specific systems. In this case, with a cloudiness meter, here we have different filters for producing reuse water. Another system, like with interesting capacities, 70 cubic meters per day in the Rio de Janeiro center. These are curiosities because sometimes builders and constructors and architects make their projects thinking of reusing rainwater and reusing rainwater. However, they do not consider the technology for treatment, and doing so becomes complicated in planting and building a water treatment system, because during the project itself, they didn't consider an area or the adequate access for the installation of the treatment plant. So this is an issue. For example, this tank here is cut off because architects and engineers forgot to build an adequate access for transporting these tanks. So an issue which is very common. Another large building, another oil Petrobras building for 3,500 functionaries. And in this case, we didn't use gray waters. However, residual waters were a mix of gray water and black water of the whole building, and the system and the treatment system, for this reason, is more expensive, more complex to be able to produce reuse water of high quality. Where does water go towards? Towards irrigation of the whole hard garden and the flushing of the toilets. Another system for Rio de Janeiro, where this becomes a building that makes treatment for a large television network in Brazil, another corporate building from Petrobras in the city of Salvador in Brazil, 7 cubic meters per day. We all have different examples of gray water use in buildings in Brazil and many regions of Brazil, always with our biologic-based systems with third filtering and chlorine application. And we also have gray water treatment stations in some of the important industries, for this case, of the center-east region of Brazil, where it becomes very common a period of 6 months of intense presentation, and a period of 6 months of drought would be a characteristic for this region. That's why the reuse of gray water. And at the end, today, we also have a more container-based solution to be able to transport all of the water treatment stages can be installed inside of a container. Here we have pre-treatment and anaerobic reactor, the decanter biologic-based system, reservoir for pumping water for the filtering station, and finally chlorine application. This is the aspect of the plant. This is the look of the depurifying plant inside of a container in a transport first installation in the site. The arrival at the functioning plant is for an industry of Rio de Janeiro also. And also likewise, we have done different production plants for reuse production, starting from gray waters for the Antarctic station in Brazil, from Brazilian Antarctic station, and here a combination of gray water reuse, which is part of the system, and with the black water treatment, which is very sensitive for its application. And even though it seems incredible, 10 years ago, more or less, we had serious issues with the availability of water found for feeding our Antarctic stations. Well, here we have a proposal which I and many engineers who work with this in Brazil are doing specifically for our government. All levels, all municipal levels, our modern and departments, all new identification, which is taught to contain a water hydro system, which in the future allow the use of alternative water sources. In other words, the use of these sources not necessarily mean or has to be done today. This is a decision of a condominium, of the owner of the building itself. However, it becomes important to consider a future where there is no sufficient water for all, because this is a question. This becomes a question. And if the building has the possibility of changing of conventional drinkable water for the consumption of drinkable and non-drinkable water in the future, it is a guarantee of water resource and an improved quality of life for us. Well, how? As the Professor Quijada has said, I am professor of the Federal University of Espiritu Santo. We have 25,000 students. We are a small university of the southeast region of Brazil. We are located on the coast here as reference to the city of Rio de Janeiro. We are 550 kilometers to the north on the coast. It is a very lovely region with lovely indigenous origin culinary. And here we have our research centers, which are well structured, which in fact we have two research centers, one for ecologic treatment reasons, other for residual water treatment, in agreement with local companies for developing technologies. We have labs which are relatively well equipped, and of course, we are always looking for cooperating. And for us, it will be a great pleasure to be able to cooperate with Chilean colleagues on this specific issue and other issues related with residual waters. Here we have some of our recent cooperations and which some continue to work. They have a tradition to cooperate, which it's important, which is always in contact with our colleagues, specifically in our field and industry. So I appreciate greatly the efforts for those who understand my Portuñol, which is my mix between Portuguese and Spanish, and I give back the word to Professor Quijada and the coordination of the event. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Ricardo. A very good presentation, a very interesting and motivating presentation. Professor Ricardo, I offer the mic to you. Well, we will make the most for his presentation. It has been important, and his whole experience in managing Greywaters with the goal of thinking of its reuse, specifically in this field of water stress and water resource limiting. I think Chile becomes a clear example. We will now make the use for some question rounds. Basically, there have been some that appeared in the chat and with question and answers where some of them have to be considered. And we've seen raised hands, and we will also offer the opportunity to them. As a first question, I would like to know, what are the main risks of functioning using these greywater reuse systems, especially for human health applications? This is an important point because water reuse installations are close to people. So, specifically, civil engineers and architects have a strong contact with the user, with higher quality reuse water. And it is possible. For example, if the system is not functioning well enough, for example, chlorine application, it becomes possible the contact of a user with the water, with contaminated water, with bacteria and viruses inside. So this is a concern. One Greywater treatment plant that produces reused water has to be well operated because it may be an issue. This is an issue that must be emphasized and supported. I also make the moment to ask is that there has been a catalog presented of different technologies that exist on gray water treatment for ritual use. What are the main characteristics, criteria to select one over the other? Do we talk about flow? Do we talk about water quality? Where are the most important factors to be able to go towards one side or the other? I believe the main point is, and being very realistic, is economic viability. So there's no sense. Several reuse systems were proposed where water is very cheap because there will be no payback. Why? Because reuse water production has a cost. And if the cost is not paid by the compensation of the drinkable water fee, it's not possible to do reuse. That's the initial point then. Then there are environmental characteristics of the edifications. In other words, there are areas or there's no area. Well, if there's an area or space, it becomes possible to think of a natural water treatment system. For example, wetland. If there's no place, we have to go towards a more compact system. And in this case, it's necessary to mechanize, and it will be more expensive without a doubt. A very important point, for example, in Germany, where Germans and German colleagues in general work with aerobic systems, mainly aerobic systems. And, well, they go towards removing 50% of organic material with aeration specifically, and they will expend energy to achieve this removal. So it's all a question of balancing and economic viability, and the consumption of power will depend. In our region, for example, our country, electrical power is expensive. So we must consider the possibility of not using electrical energy to produce reuse water. Perfect. Going more into wetland system, what would be the main limiting factors of the manageable centers, and what could be the more problematic contaminants of our natural systems, which are the more simple and more easy to maintain? Yes, well, I think that cloudiness is a limiting factor for wetlands. It is not possible to use wetlands of horizontal flow. Only horizontal flow is used because there are two issues here. They aren't as efficient in removing cloudiness, and they don't produce a water for reuse with dissolved oxygen. There is a limiting factor of water oxidization. So it is possible to capture a sulfur-based smell. And this is a limiting factor because users will reject for horizontal wetlands. The vertical ones are more efficient. They are more efficient, but they aren't able to achieve this water for reuse at a level of 5. A level of 10, it is possible. So I believe that even though users aren't able to perceive a difference between 10 and 5 of cloudiness, it becomes difficult to perceive these differences. We have to consider that in Brazil, that it is not possible to use, for example, for flushing use, for toilet flushing use. Water with cloudiness of 10. It has to be 10 below. So it becomes necessary complementary filtration systems and becomes necessary to charge for that because wetlands aren't capable of eliminating all bacteria and viruses. Another question that appears, would it be a consideration of large buildings versus pre-existing building? It's a limiting factor that the building does not consider greywater reuse when built, and the considerations can exist in water quality at different social and economic levels among these same considerations, right? Well, for existing buildings, if the hydrosanitary system is conventional, there is no economic viability to propose reuse because we have to change the whole system and we have to change towards a separating system for drinkable water, non-drinkable water, for recollecting gray water and separate them. So we've carried out several studies in this sense, and it is not viable. At least in Brazil, it is not viable. And yes, to compare social economic levels, well, I believe that would be the second question you made, right? The main point here is the price and the water price. In Brazil, we have prices, social prices. In other words, more poor populations pay smaller pricing, and these are issues for reuse because there is no economic viability in this. For example, to produce a cubic meter of reuse, of water reuse with simple technology like wetlands, we need something like 30 cents of a dollar, more or less. There are cases where the social fee is 25 cents of a dollar. So there is no economic viability to implant a reuse system in this region, which is sad. It's very sad because it is specifically in the peripheral areas where there are more poorer populations, where there is a more lack of water, a lack of sewage systems. So reuse would have to be of strategic use, but there's no economic viability. We will do a couple more questions. For example, regarding disinfection, we proposed, is it viable to propose other alternatives? What do you think? Yes, of course. Yes, disinfection, ultraviolet disinfection is very efficient. Is that in Brazil, our norm requires a chlorine level, a residual level for maintenance to avoid the development of biofilms in the tubes, in the reservoirs, in the toilets. So even though we have ultraviolet condition, we will need a bit more chlorine to maintain its residual effect. And as a last question, several people have asked around black water consideration together with gray. Would it make sense to propose in-site treatment of black water or together with gray water separately, or is it better to send black water towards more specialized systems? Well, we have a study for this, for the shopping center, which is close to where I am at my office now. And at the end, the conclusion is that it becomes more interesting the reuse of residual water, of whole residual, which is not interesting in this case to separate. And in this case, it's important to consider sophisticated technology with membrane. And likewise, if there is interesting economic, technical, practical viability. But it's a very particular case, and it becomes necessary to study case by case to define the best solution. Well, thank you very much, Professor Franci, for your question. We apologize. Due to time constraints, we can't answer all the questions that have been presented by the people. We thank all of our participants for their availability, and to make note that Dr. Franchi can answer many questions that are still pending through email. So if you need more information on the issue, you have the possibilities of contacting directly with the professor. Additionally, let us remember that the webinar will be available on the project's website, specifically greywateruse.usach. And you can consult the video as long as you need. We'll go back now to Professor Esteban Quija. Well, thank you very much, Professor Ricardo. Thank you, Professor Ricardo Franci. We are with time constraints, and we thank your great presentation, very interesting presentation. We are in continuing contact to collaborate with our project, which is focused on generating solutions, membrane and electrochemical solutions for treating and reusing domestic greywater, which is of low cost and installable at home level. So we have a lot of what to talk about and share in the next months. Excellent. Professor Quijada, Professor Abejon, to all the colleagues that are present in the webinar, thank you very much for all. And Professor Quijada, we have 2 books to download for free, and I believe that 2 or 13 master's theses and doctorate theses, which I am able to send to you later on. Our group is also working with membranes. We have a project towards producing water for direct drinkable water use. So it becomes necessary to combine more advanced solutions of treating with membranes, filtration, osmosis, deionizing capacity. So it becomes a project that we have, and will be very interesting to have a possibility of sharing and recovering. So thank you very much for all, everyone. Thank you, Professor Ricardo Franci. So we will close the session. Questions that end up may be answered later on by all. Thank you very much, and greetings. Thank you.